Hey, this is Wit and Reason, and I'm Dr. Alexis Moreno. We're going to be talking all about LGBTQ 101, what it means, best practices, and how to engage with folks in your everyday life.
Welcome to Wit and Reason, hosted by psychologist Dr. Alexis Moreno. Dr. Moreno brings her expertise to providing smart and practical explanations on human behavior by interviewing diverse health experts regarding today's ever-evolving life and culture, turning social science and research into relatable, accessible, and useful information you can use. Listen now as Dr. Moreno brings a little bit of positive mental health to your day.
Hey, Wit and Reason listeners. I am here on a very special day because I have my sibling, Lalo Moreno, Professor Lalo Moreno, here in the studio with me in person. Thank you so much for being here, Lalo.
Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
So you are my very first blood relative to be here in the studio with me.
Winning.
I emphasize
Hashtag
the
winning.
Blood relative piece because I had Jess here, who's associated with me by marriage.
Oh, I love Jess.
I know, me too. Okay, so thank you so much for being here. Very special treat for all of us. I got to introduce Lalo to all of my colleagues here at DC Radio, and it's such a very proud moment for me as a big sister to have you here.
Everyone's warm and inviting, so it's been great.
Yay! Okay, so we are here to talk all about LGBTQ.
Q.
101. Now, I kind of even in my own pronunciation of the letters, I kind of struggle a bit because it seems to change sometimes. So sometimes it's LGBT, that's it.
Yes.
LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, LGBTQ plus. And so we're now at a place, 2019.
Yes.
Put a date on it, where it's LGBTQ.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot of different ways that you can say it. It really just depends on which members of the community you're going to highlight.
Okay.
And there's a lot of disagreement even within the community. And so it really just depends on how you feel most comfortable and who you're talking about.
Got it. Okay. So for today's show, LGBTQ, and we'll go all into it. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your background in helping educate people about LGBTQ folks and what you do.
In our whole community.
Yeah.
So I do all kinds of things, really, kind of a modge podge. So I work as a professor of leadership at Loyola Marymount University, and I'm also the director of the LGBTQ Student Services Office there.
That's right,
and and all of my classes around leadership really focus on queer leadership and queer narratives and how we can learn different forms of leadership from the queer community and what does that look like for us. Oftentimes we don't really get represented in things like history or leadership or business, and so talking about it in courses really helps students who otherwise wouldn't have access to that information. I also focus on a business that my business partner and I started called Expanding Identities Development. Whoop, whoop.
Still shout out,
so I'm
Expanding Identities.
Here repping EID, and we are a training and consulting company that focuses on the leadership and brilliance and engagement of queer cultural proficiency, both within the workforce, nonprofits, universities, and that work funds the free work that we do in high school and middle school GSAs and pride clubs, right? We spend a whole bunch of time telling our students and telling our youth that it's going to get better and that the world is going to be ready to receive them. And oftentimes we run into this situation where employers aren't ready or don't have policies or even bathrooms for us.
Yeah.
And so we're setting them up for failure by not preparing these employment opportunities so that they can seek gainful employment that are also validating of their identities.
Absolutely right. And I mean, it makes me think of those visual graphics that we see as far as the amount of income that people make according to their demographic population. So you see women making less than men still.
Yep.
You see Black or African American folks, Latinx folks making less and less than white folks. And then, of course, you'll even consider LGBTQ folks.
Yeah, definitely.
And that breakdown.
The Williams Institute out of UCLA's law program did a study, I believe last year, that was on the socioeconomic gain of LGBTQ, specifically lesbian couples versus gay couples, so gay male couples. And you'll see that we have a statistical difference of socioeconomic attainment over our lifespan because there's two female-identified folks in a relationship as opposed to two male-identified folks. And then it also also gets incredibly less the more that you engage race and educational attainment. Most of us can't make it through university and things of that nature, either because we don't have financial support or family support.
Yeah.
And so those things all play a big factor.
Yeah. Okay, so since this is 101, let's rewind a bit. Can you define all of the letters?
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So L in LGBTQ, I'm really happy that it comes first because it's one of my populations.
A little bias.
Yes. So just a little bit.
Yeah.
So L stands for lesbian. So those are assigned female at birth or female identified folks who engage in relationship together. So two females or two female identified folks. And that's none of these are really respective to your biological makeup. So how you were identified by your doctor at birth. So this is a self-identification.
Got it.
And then the G in LGBT is for gay. You could use gay as a lesbian person. I use it sometimes, like I'm gay.
Yeah.
But it generally and traditionally stands for gay men in this population, or same-sex loving, same gender loving.
And when lesbians use gay as an identifier, is that just within the lesbian community, or is it appropriate for cisgender heterosexuals to identify lesbians as gay?
I think it really just depends on your community.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't make it as a best practice.
Okay.
Just like identify however this person has self-identified. Right?
Got it.
Don't ascribe things to people. The whole notion of our community, the whole ethos is not to make assumptions, right? And letting people identify for themselves and giving them the agency and the power to really identify and label ourselves.
What a crazy idea
What?
that
Like letting people name themselves.
That we're encouraging people to learn about and listen to other people and use that information to inform how they interact with them.
Exactly, right?
Wow. Okay.
Concept.
All right, so then we got B.
Yes, so that stands for our bisexual community.
Okay.
Oftentimes one of our most underrepresented communities because they experience a lot of erasure, either because when they're in a same-sex couple, it erases their bisexual nature of being attracted to another gender, and then there's also passing privilege that exists there as well, so they can pass as cisgender heterosexual couples. And so there's a lot of discussion there. So not a lot of attention, but more and more attention is being drawn towards our bi community, especially as our statistics are incredibly growing. More youth now are identifying in the bisexual, pansexual area than they are lesbian or gay.
Yeah.
And so bisexual, not to be confused with pansexual, but bisexual folks is two or more genders, an attraction to two or more genders, not necessarily an attraction to male or female folks.
Okay. And then you also mentioned pansexual, so might as well throw that out there.
So that's the P in LGBTQIAP.
I didn't even mention that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So pansexual, not an attraction to bread, if you're saying bread in Spanish, not that, or an attraction to pans. So it's an attraction to humans based on, or not based on their gender or sexual makeup. Okay. So not based on their gender presentation, right? You talk about feminine clothing and attire as we as society determine what feminine coded things are.
Right.
It's more an attraction to that person.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Okay. So then we also have the T.
Yes, that's for our transgender community. Yay! So our trans community is encompassing of those who identify as trans male or trans female. It also includes our non-binary community, our gender non-conforming community. So they all kind of exist under this umbrella of transness, but the experiences are vastly different across the board.
Right.
So I, as a non-binary or bi-gender person, fall under the trans umbrella, but my experience is vastly different from a trans woman, especially a trans woman of color.
Right.
And so we have different levels of access and different levels of privilege that we then support each other with. And so those are for our folks who do not identify with how they were assigned at birth, right? So you're born, the doctor looks in between your legs, which is often super problematic, but looks in between your legs and determines that your gender, which often gets conflated with sex, is male or female. And really, it's far more complex because it involves your chromosomes, and that's where we get into intersex folks. And so those folks do not identify with how the doctor assigned them at birth.
Got it. Okay. So does everyone get that?
That was like a big overview. It was a lot of information.
Well, and I have a follow-up question for the T.
Okay.
Okay. So the T in LGBTQ stands for transgender, which is like this umbrella.
Yes.
Now, can you help explain for our listeners the difference between transgender and transsexual? or transvestites? Or
yes.
Is that even appropriate?
Yeah, well, we don't use transvestites or transsexuals anymore. There are members of the community who do. So if someone self-identifies, perfectly fine. Once again, it's about us identifying ourselves.
Yeah.
But as a broad-based community, even for our cisgender heterosexual folks, don't use transsexual or transvestite, especially transvestite. It really depends on where you are around the world. So in Mexico, transvestis is commonly used, and it's a very empowering term. Here, it really isn't as much. So our best practice is don't use it. Just use transgender or trans folks as a general best practice, and then let someone self-identify otherwise. But it's more of an internal community label as opposed to something that we'd be referred to by others.
And what's the reason why it's not used anymore, not recommended?
So it has a historical denigrating vocabulary to it. It has a lot of trauma associated, similar to the word queer, which has been reclaimed by parts of our community, but not all of our community. And so there are some folks who use it to self-identify because it's most accurate for them. In historical contexts, transsexuals would be folks who had actually gone through the surgery or had intention of going through surgery. Not all transgender folks want to go through surgery, or they'll do some parts of surgery, right? So the objective isn't to pass as a cisgendered person all the time. Sometimes it is for some folks. But it has a lot of historical negative connotation to it, so most people don't use it anymore. But some of our members do.
Cool.
Some of our community members do.
Keep a lookout on your language, people. We're sticking to transgender.
Yeah, or trans folks.
Or trans folks.
Yeah.
I like folks. I don't know why it's like a struggle for me to get that word out of my mouth, but I do like it because I want some kind of word that I could feel comfortable to like safely use while I'm like out there on the streets.
Yeah.
You know, like talking to strangers.
Yeah. I wouldn't say like a transgender, like that's super inappropriate.
No, yeah.
But you could be like trans folks, or
Trans folks,
I like to shorten it because I feel like it's more of a popular nomenclature.
Or this
it's more
person is
familial.
transgender.
Yeah. And you definitely don't want to add the ED to transgendered. It elicits that something has happened to this person, or that something, that this is something that needs to be changed or adjusted.
Right.
Right. And so transgender, or transgender community, or trans community.
All right. Now there's still the Q.
Yes. So the Q can stand for questioning, which is one of the most popular ones, but Q also stands for queer, which can be...
that's what I was confused about. I was like, okay, which one is it?
So that's the great thing about the LGBT community, or as I like to lovingly call the queer community, and I'll explain why in a minute, is that everything is really different based on that person. And so it can be quite confusing. It can be overwhelming, and that's okay, right? We are undoing a millennia of socialization, right? We've been socialized to think of people in this one way. And so we're working through kind of deconstructing that and becoming more holistic about how we view people and how we view their identities and how we engage with them.
So any discomfort or confusion you might be feeling at this point is a good thing.
Because you're processing.
Yeah, you're learning something new. It's an evolving, I don't know, like evolving like aspect of life. And so if you are like struggling with like, okay, there's these letters and I got to know what they each mean. And like everyone has their own interpretation of it. And it depends on what country I'm in. If you're feeling overwhelmed and confused, then you're on the right track. Then we're doing our job.
And that's okay, right? Just take a deep breath and remember that no one expects you to know everything. Right? That's why there are people like me who do this work, because our job is to educate folks from this perspective, right? And so that our community members as individuals don't have to do that on their day-to-day. Which is really exhausting. And so that's why I'm really passionate about this work and increasing this education so that, you know, my kiddos or the students that I work with don't have to do this every single day with every single faculty member or every single person that they meet.
Right. Ideally, it would just be like introducing yourself, you know, under any circumstances. Hi, I'm, you know, Alexis Moreno. You know, my pronouns are she, her, and then that's it.
Yeah, well, I usually do, hi, my name is Lalo Moreno. My pronouns are they and them. How may I refer to you today? Right, because it could, right, gender identity is fluid in some contexts. And so one day someone might feel comfortable with she and her. The next day they might prefer they and them. The next day it might be he and him. Right, so I like to
be really
say,
tough for people who interact with them, though. So
it can be.
Would the person then, so then the person would then have to, explain their pronouns for that time period, right? Or if it switches?
You would just give them the opportunity to share their pronouns again.
How,
right?
Like how frequently you think?
It's up to them. I'll ask a student every time they come in for a meeting.
Okay.
I'll just say like, hey, how are you? What pronouns are we using today? And then they'll tell me, and I move forward.
Okay,
right?
cool.
So it's most of the work. So it's less about remembering what their pronouns are any given day and charting it for them.
That would be really tricky. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I struggle with names. Okay, and that's like the very basic like human social skill, and I struggle so much with names. And so the thought of having to then like, adjust these things and like remember people's pronouns and stuff, and if it changes, I'm like, oh shoot, I'm screwed.
Yeah. It's a process.
Yeah.
It's a process.
But you're saying, okay, it's not necessarily our responsibility as like social creatures out there to remember everyone's pronouns.
It's more about remembering to ask people and to give people the space to claim their own names and their own labels, and then use that name and label from then on, and then giving them the space again if they want to adjust them.
Okay. Cool.
And so I'll always check in with my students or with people that I work with, and that's a part of my role and of my job, but it's also something that I've instilled in myself as a best practice.
Yeah.
You'll find that our language is so inherently gendered in everything that we talk about.
It is.
And so I remember when I started doing this work about definitely a decade, but around 7 or so years ago, I was doing a lot of work with the LA LGBT Center and training and education, and more so with, high school and middle school students. But I wanted to really try and make things as gender neutral as possible to give people the opportunity to share with me their gendered identities. And so a big part of that was I spent a solid 3 weeks not gendering anything.
Yeah.
I used they and them for almost everything, or I tried to. And anything after 3 weeks becomes a habit. And so
I'm like looking at the calendar like, it's been like a year for me.
So I did this exercise. This exercise, and this was like, something that I really wanted to try out. And I, realized how much everything was gendered, but then also B, realized how after practicing and making everything neutral for me really helped me be more aware of when I'm asking people or how I can engage with folks.
Yeah.
And so I generally come for myself as a best practice, from a neutral stance until otherwise specified. And it's not making neutrality for neutrality's sake. It's more about giving people the space and time.
Yeah.
Right. So that's more of the theme of giving space and time to people, giving them the agency, and not making assumptions about how they may identify based on how they're dressed or how their voice sounds, right? Or
because
how they might look.
People screw that. I mean, even before people were talking more about gender neutrality, people were already struggling with like masculine and feminine things because, some women would be mistaken as masculine, and so just kind of wiping it all and going to a neutral level will just help everyone avoid all kinds of awkward
shenanigans.
moments. Yeah.
Right, because then if you're coming from a space of neutral or a space of non, then I'm leaving it open for you to tell me who you are. And I haven't imposed my idea of who you are, so it's less work for me to remember who you are when you tell me, because I haven't made an assumption as to how you're going to refer to yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're siblings.
Yes.
we're related, grew up together. And, going through this process with you as your big sister has been really interesting for me because, I've studied psychology. I have like graduate level education in like human beings. We do take some courses in multicultural like competency, humility, sexual orientation, LGBTQ related aspects of people that we work with. And yet I wouldn't be as prepared as a professional and like a person in this world if it wasn't for you. And I know that I'm sure like I've fumbled along the way, Don't nod.
You have. Yes. You can't be like, I've done that.
Yes.
I'm like, yes, you have.
Yes.
This is the affirmative.
Yes. No, I'm sure I fumbled along the way because, we have like our professional hats and then we have like our personal hats. And then we're all just learning along the way. And there's like only so much education you could get in textbooks. And even in your professional lives, if you're working in social services. But it's either way, I think a lot of this process comes with humility and self-compassion to like understand like it is a big switch for people, regardless of where you come from in your education, and to just have that patience with yourself and with others, and continuing to be open with learning about everyone's experiences and process and where they're at. And
I think also, and that's what one of the best feedback components that we get as Expanding Identities Development when we do trainings. The number one thing in all of our, report backs is, we loved how, affirming you were of folks who are having a hard time, right?
Yeah.
This isn't something where we're trying to shame people. We understand that this is new to a lot of people, even though it's not new to the world, or it's not new to identity development, or to queer folks or LGBTQ folks in general. But that it's new to a lot of people to think of the world in a different way and to think of humans in a different way. And so when we have these conversations, we want to come from a space of, right, we can't ensure that every space is going to be safe for people. I can't guarantee that, especially now in this world. But what I can guarantee is that we're all going to come from a brave space, that you can talk to me with the language that you have at your disposal. And I'm not going to shame you for that, right? You are in a process of learning and becoming.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people are they prohibit themselves from talking because they're afraid of saying something offensive,
Absolutely.
or they're afraid of messing up or being rude. And believe me, we have heard it all. We do this training with elementary students, and they are so unfiltered, and I love them for it. But we've really heard it all. And so a big part of it is just, we have picked up these things in our society and these messages and these undertones that we might not even really relate to or comprehend, but they exist in our peripheries. They're a part of our biases. And we all have them because we're human and we soak up information at a rapid rate. And our jobs as our brains are designed to categorize things and put them into boxes. And people are not boxes. So we're undoing all of the boxes that we have created this whole time. And so wanting to really just allow people the space to use the language that they have, to ask us questions, to not worry about being rude or inappropriate, so that we can help them learn, right? Learning is a brave process. It is terrifying to admit that you do not know something. And it's okay to not know something. It's just about the effort and the attempt that you're trying to make to understand people.
It's been quite a journey. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm privileged in a sense to have you as a sibling to like help educate me about and that you feel comfortable enough to like talk to me about all of these things every step of the way in our lives together. And I feel so fortunate that you have felt comfortable to talk to me about all of these things and work with me as I like try to learn and understand and appreciate and allow me to be that person in our family system, too, to help advocate, for you and raise awareness within our family system, because we're Mexican.
We're Mexican American.
We're Mexican American.
That's a whole thing.
Raised Catholic, so talk about putting people in boxes, right? And so we have to, kind of deconstruct these things even within our own family system. And that's hard as well. And I always tell people that that my sister is probably one of my biggest allies, right? Like, you're the Marines. You go in first and you explain things to the family so that when I come in, I don't get a bunch of ridiculous questions that make me tired and I have to answer, and I'm not getting paid for that at that point. Right. No one's paying me. So at that point, I think it's, it's finding that person who is your ally, not only in your family, if you're fortunate enough to have an ally in your family, but also in your friendship group, to find someone who can help you find an affirmative therapist, which is, yes, you take a couple of classes and that's great. But this work is so, and these identities are so, ambiguous and there's just so much to them. They're so nuanced that it's really hard to find a good therapist who knows things. The tricky thing is that it's fluid and it's evolving, and as therapists, we are required ongoing continuing education, specifically in LGBTQ. In addition to like law and ethics, like it's up there with everything else because it's one of those things that's continuously evolving. So that is something we are required to have additional training in. And at the same time, I mean, you only know as much as you know, and you don't know what you don't know, know? So it does take a lot of engagement.
And therapy is like one venue, right? And that's why I really bring up allyship in this concept of what it means to be there. And I think of allyship a little less about like being this passive person, but I think of it more of a co-conspirator. Yeah. You are co-conspiring with me to change the way and to adapt the way that people see me, to see my community, to understand me, to ask me who I am, as opposed to making assumptions. Mm-hmm. And it's processing through that together and using different levels of your own privilege to kind of make space for me. I always tell my students it's less about our names in history books and it's more about us kicking doors down and stepping out of the way so that people who don't have that access can go in there and to take the stage, right? Mm-hmm. And that means deferring your own merit, your own privilege, your own power in those spaces. Mm-hmm. But it's really important as we look to being allies and accomplices together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all of your education and that you've been sharing with us on today's show, LGBTQ 101. What would you say would be like 3 to 5 best practices or recommendations you would make for everybody? You know, either whether they identify themselves within the LGBTQ population or cisgender heterosexuals across the board. What would you think would be some tips?
So I would suggest first and foremost, never make assumptions. That's the first one.
That's a great one. Yeah,
rule
that was
number
a great
one.
Message.
No assumptions about people, how they identify, what they're wearing, what they're dressing as, how they're trying to present themselves. So, no assumptions. Giving people the agency and the space to really identify. Mm-hmm. The next would be never, ever, ever out anyone. Just because someone's out in one space doesn't mean that they're out in all spaces. So always check with people to make sure that you are referring to them in the right context at the right space and time. Mm-hmm. So I have some students or I have some folks in my life who are, out with their family, but they're not out at school, or they're out in one class, in history class, but they're not out in their sociology class, right? So really asking and making sure that you're referring to people in the right space too. Yeah. And that's a good practice of just being mindful of, people's identities and having that agency and the consent to refer to them how they would like to be referred. Because a lot of this is really around consent as well. And we can totally do a whole other show on like consent and queerness.
That's so true.
And so, that would be the second one. The third one would be to continue your own education. It is not incumbent upon queer folks or LGBT folks to educate you. Some of us really love to do it, like me, right? I've taken this on as my job.
But like you said, when you're with your family and you're off the clock, you're not getting paid for it.
I'm not doing it.
That's some freaking emotional labor there,
it is.
And so everyone needs to do their own education as well. And, the internet can be all so kinds of crazy. So what would be like one great resource that you would recommend for people?
I'm like, just like shameless plug. Expanding Identities Development. Right?
I hear that's like a great company.
It's a great organization. We are very integral about which resources that we present to people, making sure that it is intersectional in that I'm not only considering your gender identity or your sexual orientation, but I'm considering your race, your ethnicity, your religious background, your socioeconomic status. So when I make recommendations for references or resources, those are some of the things that I consider when I put them all together for folks. Another really great organization would be PFLAG, so Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gay Folks. They are open to all folks and all identities. It's just a bit of an older organization, so thus the name. So for Parents and Friends, that would be another really amazing organization. And if you're into like stats and resources, the Williams Institute is constantly putting out new content if you're interested in more of the statistics.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Lalo Moreno. You can put all of these tips and activities into action today. Visit witandreason.com to get links to the resources we shared on today's show and to connect with me, Dr. Alexis Moreno, and Professor Lalo Moreno from Expanding Identities Development. Did you hear something on the show today that you relate to on a personal level? Share your story. Send us your recording on witandreason.com/speakup, and we may be able to post it on our LGBTQ and support show page to help others navigate LGBTQ best practices. A special thank you to DC Radio and Professor Lalo Moreno. And of course, thank you all for listening. Stay posted on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Wit and Reason and DC Radio for our next show. I'm Dr. Alexis Moreno. Let's keep the conversation going.